Welcome back to an astonishing time for me with someone I consider a hero, world authority on vitamin D, the person that truly will bust the myths, demystify, and show you how to have vitamin D sufficiency throughout your life, which the more we get into this, you are going to find it is, in my opinion, one of the magic bullets that you can find on a health food store shelf that could revolutionize your health, your children's health, provide longevity, and help you avoid some devastating diseases. We're welcoming back Dr. Michael Holick, professor of medicine at BU Medical Center. Again, so many more accolades we could put his name on, so many authored papers, co-authored papers, an individual that's been doing this for decades and is just as excited about vitamin D research today, I think, as he was when he did his original experiment decades ago with one of his classmates. So welcome back again, Michael Holick. We're so appreciative you're here. Off camera we were talking, and we want to cover a base that we didn't cover as we were talking before, and that is the difficulty and the struggle for people of color, of different ethnicities, Asian, Black, others, to even be able to absorb vitamin D from the sun, and what that may translate into for them of how do they stay vitamin D sufficient.
So you're correct. Mother Nature designed our skin for our environment. So people living at the equator, for example, have very dark skin. But what's interesting is that Mother Nature didn't make it so dark that they can't make vitamin D. And in fact, there was a study done in Maasai herders. They showed that Maasai herders outside every day were literally making thousands of units of vitamin D a day because their blood levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D is 40 to 60 nanograms per ml, right? That preferred range that I had mentioned to you before.
Right.
But people of color, they have natural sunscreen. And as a result, they're not as efficient in making vitamin D in their skin. And as a result, you would think that they need more vitamin D. But the answer is no. We've done the study, and others have as well. The same amount that we recommend for everyone. Children, 400 to 1,000 units a day. Infants, 400 to 1,000 units a day. Children, 600 to 1,000 units a day. Adults, 1,500 to 2,000 units a day. If you're obese, 2 to 3 times more.
Right.
And you're welcome to take 3,000 to 5,000 units a day. This will not cause toxicity.
Yeah, and that's what I want to reemphasize before we move on with some other questions, and that is the danger of toxicity with vitamin D, as discussed previously with Dr. Holick. It's just almost impossible. I've even heard other doctors say that looked at each other and they said, it was almost a nudge, nudge, wink, wink moment. They said, of the thousands of patients you've had that you've put on vitamin D and had on vitamin D for years, how many have ever been toxic, and have you ever seen any toxic vitamin D exposure in any patient populations of friends and colleagues? And they're like, have never seen it. So, yeah, to your point. So the role of epidemiology in studying the relationship between vitamin D levels and the incidence of chronic disease. Now, in our first segment, you ran down a quick list, but if we can dial in that a little closer, heart disease, diabetes, cancers, things like that, help us understand, because there isn't just a little bit of research out there. There are mountains of research related to vitamin D, even long-term randomized clinical trials of large populations of people in different countries showing incredible things as it relates to cancers and vitamin D. So take us down that road, Dr. Holick.
So out of the Nurses' Health Study out of Harvard, when they related vitamin D intake and blood level of 25-hydroxyvitamin D with risk of breast cancer, those that had a blood level in the range of about 40 nanograms per ml had reduced risk of breast cancer by more than 40%.
Hold on, stop the tape. I want to repeat that for everybody just listening. Just a blood level for these nurses in a Harvard study, 40 nanograms per mil, reduced their incidence of breast cancer or their potential for breast cancer by 40%.
By more than 40%.
By
That's
more than
correct.
40%. Staggering information. Okay, keep going.
There's also good evidence, epidemiologic evidence, of looking at latitude and colorectal cancer. And the higher the latitude that you live, higher is your risk for colorectal cancer.
Wow.
So it's been suggested that vitamin D sufficiency can help reduce that risk.
Okay.
Also, a very interesting study just came out that I did an editorial for, and that is that there was a Japanese group that asked a simple question. If you give 2,000 units of vitamin D a day to cancer patients that have cancer of the digestive tract, your esophagus, stomach, colon, and follow their 5-year survival, was there any benefit? And in 2019, they reported in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, no benefit. And so I talk about this. It's like almost like one of the last nails in the coffin for vitamin D. But wait, in this past year, they then relooked at their data and they realized something. And that is those that were vitamin D sufficient or had higher blood levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D and were getting 2,000 units of vitamin D had a significant decreased risk of mortality from the cancer.
Interesting.
So they went back and did an additional analysis. We know that cancers are very clever, and so is the body. The body has a gene called the p53 gene.
Yep.
And its protein is one of the major controllers of cell growth and preventing cancer.
Right.
So when a cancer cell becomes active, one of the first things it may do is to mutate your p53 gene. By mutating that p53 gene in the cancer cell, it now makes a mutant p53. That mutant p53 then can actually prevent active vitamin D from regulating cell growth and reducing risk of cancer. So with all this information, what they decided to do was to look at their patient population and ask the question, for those that had an antibody to p53, meaning that they were now generating an antibody against the mutant p53, and giving 2,000 units of vitamin D a day for the 5 years, did it make any difference on mortality? And it improved survival by more than 150%. So 2,000 units of vitamin D a day, and your body is fighting the cancer as best it can by increasing your immune response to the mutant p53. Those two in combination work together.
Wow, staggering information for colorectal cancer and the simplicity of just taking 2,000 units a day. And shame on those people that interpret data so wrongly in many studies, right? We see this over and over. It's like, oh, but we overlooked that.
Right. But also the VITAL study, right, it got a lot of publicity saying that vitamin D has no benefit, is they showed 25% reduced risk of cancer and mortality by taking 2,000 units of vitamin D a day.
Impressive. So, well, you've mentioned one of the underlying mechanisms. I'm familiar with, just know enough to be dangerous about wild-type p53 and gene expression as it relates to cancer, and my eyes will glaze over if you try to take me down that road. So I appreciate you speaking in layman's terms. But do we know of other underlying mechanisms as it relates to vitamin D and diabetes, vitamin D and cancer, or broad number of cancers? I learned something from one of your lectures that blew my mind, and it was like, we literally have to enact laws to get more people vitamin D sufficient, because this whole cascade of gene expression in the way vitamin D affects so many metabolic processes, which one of your colleagues out there, Thomas Seyfried at Boston University, I believe he's one of your colleagues out there. He's one of the guys that's been preaching this metabolic approach to cancer. And then when I heard you talk about vitamin D influencing all these genetic pathways, metabolic pathways, I was just shocked. So what are some of the underlying mechanisms that we actually understand from research regarding how it affects diabetes? What's it doing there to help someone out? What's it doing in this cancer realm? You mentioned one of them, wild type P53.
Right. So for type 2 diabetes, there was a study done where they gave pre-diabetic patients vitamin D and originally concluded that there was no benefit. But again, if you look at the data carefully and you look at those that were vitamin D sufficient and becoming more sufficient, it reduced their risk of getting type 2 diabetes. Your beta islet cells have a vitamin D receptor. The active form of vitamin D will stimulate insulin production. And so there is a relationship, again, from the National Health Survey data to show that those adults that have the highest intake of vitamin D and adequate calcium intake, relative risk reduction for type 2 diabetes was 33%.
Wow. And it's an epidemic that we have going on among the youth as well as adult populations, to be able to reduce that risk by a third by getting your vitamin D and calcium levels right is magic to me. And again, there should be some kind of regulations passed to put it in more foods or something.
So in terms of cancer, it works in a variety of ways, which makes good sense. So the active form of vitamin D at the genomic level regulates cellular growth. And as I had mentioned earlier on, when we showed in skin cells, epidermal
Mm-hmm.
cells, it downregulates proliferation and it induces terminal differentiation. And it does that in many cells in the body because almost all your cells have a vitamin D receptor. In addition, if it can't, if all of a sudden the cell becomes malignant, the cell needs nutrition. And so as a result, vitamin D helps as, as an anti-angiogenic factor so that it shuts down the blood supply to this tiny cancer that's starting to grow. And so vitamin D has a variety of ways of trying to control cell growth. And then if the cell does get crazy, it can induce its own destruction called apoptosis,
Right?
and it can prevent angiogenesis, which is feeding that cancer.
Right.
And as a result, the cancer cell continues to try to fight vitamin D in one way, like I said, by mutating a protein that prevents the active vitamin D from doing its business in the cell.
So you've already discussed some statistics relating to populations of different people with cancers, diabetes. Um, is there a history that predates supplementation and the discovery of the hormone vitamin D? Is there a history of sunlight itself being utilized? I mean, can we go take snapshots? I love empirical studies, by the way, taken from history snapshots of things that practitioners have done. Has the sun always been one of our healers and we just didn't really discover that until a couple of hundred years ago?
I mean, even the Egyptians, have on the hieroglyphics the worshiping of the sun. They've always appreciated the sun for its healthful benefits. Hippocrates appreciated the beneficial effect of sunbathing. So the Greeks were very much into recommending sunbathing. And then all of a sudden, people started migrating into cities and starting burning coal. and causing lots of pollution. And all of a sudden, in the 1600s, rickets appeared. And it was a devastating disease because it caused growth retardation, caused bowed legs, and ultimately it could cause death. And that existed from the 1600s until 1921,
Oh, wow.
when Dr. Hess in New York City finally showed take some children with rickets, put them on the roof of a New York City hospital, and demonstrated that they could cure rickets.
That's phenomenal. So interesting. You covered a base there that I wanted to kind of run back to real quick. It escapes me at the moment, but vitamin D, the sunlight correlation that we have there, and health is something that you're saying throughout history, people have intuitively known that it was going to help us. Is there anything going on in your recent world that is one of the new ahas for Dr. Michael Holick? Because it seems like you always have your hand in these new research projects moving forward. Is there anything going on in your world right now that you're excited about that you could give us a peek into as it relates to, hey, we are looking at this, we're not sure if we're going to discover something new, but this is what we're looking into?
So I'll make two comments. The first is, when you're exposed to sunlight, what's really remarkable to me is that you're being exposed to all types of energy waves, right? These packets of energy. And there's really good evidence that when you're exposed to sunlight, you make beta endorphin in your skin, which makes you feel better.
Absolutely.
You produce nitric oxide, which also causes vasodilation for your blood pressure to drop. It regulates a gene that regulates the production of cortisol in your adrenal glands. So there are all types of other activities that are occurring when you are exposed to sunlight. So it's not just vitamin D itself. In terms of the history again of sunlight, it was a Polish physician in 1822 that realized children living in Warsaw had a high incidence of rickets. Children living in the rural areas didn't. And he had concluded in 1822, strong and obvious is the exposure of sunlight in preventing rickets. Now, who's going to believe a Polish physician in 1822? Right? And so it took 100 years, to be able to appreciate that. People of color are at much higher risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and type 2 diabetes, among others. And we think a lot of it is related to the fact that they are more vitamin D deficient because their skin is not as efficient in producing vitamin D.
From these last several minutes with you, to me, the overarching theme is that vitamin D steps up as a champion as it relates to preventing an individual from suffering the tragedy and the terror of some of the worst diseases out there, different types of cancers, metabolic disorders, pre-diabetes, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. All these things are tied to our vitamin D sufficiency. I want people to remember how they can connect with you. It's really important to me that people get on the vitamin D train with this gentleman, the world's expert, in my opinion. He's got an incredible book. I want you to share it with people. I want you to buy it for friends and loved ones. The Vitamin D Solution by Dr. Michael Holick, and a website where you can get a host of all kinds of information, including something I'm going to tease out there a little bit, something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, something I knew nothing about until just a few years ago, but I'm hearing more and more from doctors all over. We're planning on having Dr. Holick back to talk about this phenomenon that's taking place and how they're learning how to navigate people through this world. drmichaelholick.org, DrMichael.org is the way you can get a hold of him.
Holick.
Oh, yeah. DrMichaelHolick.org, and Facebook at Dr. Michael Holick. We're going to continue this conversation here.